And I will turn it over to Dr. Justin Levitt of National Demographics, who is the city's demographer, and he will explain who he is and how this process works, and talk to you about tonight and get your feedback on the composition of the districts. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone who's here tonight. As Ms. Lyon mentioned, my name is Dr. Justin Levitt with National Demographics. We're a company that really, I think, specializes in helping cities go through this process of transitioning from at-large to district elections. Because one of the things we'll emphasize tonight is that Imperial Beach is not alone. We actually just hit the 100 city mark about 2 or 3 months ago in terms of the number of cities that have switched in just the past 7 or 8 years to district elections. And that doesn't include the over 150 school districts, 30 special districts, even a couple of counties. San Mateo County had at-large elections, was forced to switch to district elections because of the same law that I'll talk about tonight. Our firm has worked with the vast majority of these cities. We've worked with about 70 cities now making this transition. And in addition, we worked with the city of San Diego back in 2011. We worked with the South Bay Union High School District when they went through their process, citizen-driven process, back in 2013. And I actually went to graduate school here at UCSD. That's where my doctorate's from. So I have a connection to this part of the city, or this part of the state, and even this part of the city. And so what is this California Voting Rights Act? Well, it's a law that was written to make it easier to force cities to switch from at-large to district elections. And I say cities, I also mean school districts and other jurisdictions like water districts and everything else. What it does is it makes it easier for a district to be held liable, or a city to be held liable. And most cities that have switched have not actually admitted any liability under the California Voting Rights Act. They've made this decision as the result of a demand letter. Someone comes in and claims that you might have this, and rather than do the millions of dollars of research and work, the city decides to switch. And as we can see, it really has been in the millions. These are some of the settlements that have been paid out, either a result of losses like Palmdale lost in court, or as a result of settlements between cities and attorneys. The California Voting Rights Act actually has a provision in it that says that even if the city wins, it can't recoup its costs from the defense, unlike almost any other matter in civil court. And so that makes it very easy for a city to lose over, well into 7 or 8 figures, or really 6 or 7 figures in one of these suits. And you can just see the scale that's taken place of this change across the city, or across the state. I know some of you look like maybe taking pictures of this. We will be putting this presentation online so that you have a copy of it if you want to read it in more detail as well. And we're happy to answer questions later on after the presentation about this as well. Because of this, because of the number of cities that have gone through it, the state has recognized that there needs to be some safeguards, and what they've done is established a 90-day window. After the city decides to make the transition to district elections, they have 90 days to complete the process, and if they complete it in 90 days, they can't be held liable any more than the $30,000 that's allowed in state law for a demand letter, or for a change initiated by a demand letter. And so the city intends to complete the process in 90 days. We've laid out the calendar here. This is a quick time frame, but I want to talk about a couple of silver linings here. The first is that we do have, since our first 2 public hearings are kind of back-to-back today and tomorrow, that gives us a nice period of time between now and when the district maps have to be published. They have to be published 7 days in advance of the 3rd public hearing. That means that any initial draft maps have to be posted by October 10th for that meeting on the 17th. So if you or anyone you know wants to submit anything, and tomorrow we will have paper maps available as well as a PDF online where you can draw on it. send it into the district or send it into the city. That will need to be into us at least 2 days before the 10th, October 8th, so that we have time to process it, to draw it in, and to make sure that it is available on the 10th. Because that's our deadline. If we don't have it on the 10th, we can't show it on the 17th. And actually, council can't discuss it on the 17th either. But that's not the end of the process. On the 17th, the council can request changes. People who come to that hearing can make comments, and they can continue to draw their own maps based on the maps that are available. And so at our fourth public hearing, we'll have a different set of maps, possibly. And those maps are due October 31st for the November 7th public hearing, or they'll be due on the 29th, so that they can be posted on the 31st for that November 7th public hearing. At that hearing is when the council will make their initial selection of a map and introduce the ordinance that will be adopted 2 weeks later. And that will be actually a month later because of Thanksgiving. I always forget about that meeting. But it'll be December 5th when that second reading is held. I know we're going to have an election right in the middle of this. It's going to be very chaotic and crazy, but this keeps us within the 90 days. We finish before the end of the year. And the silver lining I'm talking about is that there will be one election held in these new districts, one set of elections held. But in 2020, we're going to be taking the 2020 census. And as a result, we're going to get some new population numbers. And in 2021, we're going to have to take another look at the city and see whether or not the numbers still are in balance, whether or not there's any potential changes to the population between now and 2020. And we're going to get to go through this again. The thing about that process in 2021 is it's not limited to 90 days. That's only for this initial change to districts. So the city has the opportunity to have a more thoughtful or maybe more extended process than we have to make this change right now. But that being said, this is important because this is our first election, or this is our first time we're drawing districts. I guarantee that what we start with in 2021 will be the current set of lines drawn, because that's how it always works in every place I've seen. And so it may not be going all the way to the drawing board, but if you get involved today, you could set the city's course for the next 30 or 40 years even. Because these lines will be probably the basis for what gets adopted, or for what we start with. Not gets adopted, but at least what we start with in 2021. So I'm encouraging you and thanking you all for coming out and telling you this is your chance to really have an impact on the future of Imperial Beach. So what do we use when drawing districts? What kind of factors do we take into account? Well, on the left-hand column, we have our must-dos. These are things that federal and state law require us to look into. And the number one is population equality. Each district has to have the same number of total residents. This includes everyone counted in the 2010 census. Children, non-citizens, people staying at hotels, people who happen to be stationed at military bases on April 1st, 2010. So that's our target number. We're going to be dividing that number, and we're going to get our ideal population from that. Now, what about registered voters? What about citizens? Well, that can vary from district to district. In fact, the courts have said that that's perfectly fine, that some districts might have more voters than other districts. We can consider that, especially as a secondary factor, but the primary balance has to be total population. And that difference is 10%. The difference in population between the largest and smallest is 10%. So here, if you have a population of about 20,000 people, each district has to be within, maybe 1,000 people or so from that ideal number. Based on the 2010 census data. Yes, it's arbitrary, but that's what the courts have required. So in 2020, we're going to be taking a new census, and in 2021, we're going to get that new data and redraw the lines. So, like I said, we're going to be going through the redistricting process soon, but this is going to set the course for the future. So if I could ask everyone to hold on to their questions until I finish. I only have a couple more slides left, I promise. And I know these criteria are where we have a lot of questions, so maybe I'll answer them when I go through the other criteria. The other thing we have to do is follow the Federal Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act. Essentially, this provision talks about not diluting protected classes of voters. So groups that have faced historically discrimination in registration, voting, obtaining materials in another language other than English are protected under the Federal Voting Rights Act. We have to look and see whether or not there are concentrations or neighborhoods where we see higher rates of population of Latinos or Asian Americans, for example. And it's important to not divide those neighborhoods in half, or not to to ensure that they have the maximum opportunity to elect. It doesn't guarantee election, but it guarantees an opportunity to elect. And so we'll look at this actually in the following slide. In addition to this, there are the things that we call the can-dos on the right-hand column. These are things that we need to balance out with what we need to do. One more thing I should mention, race cannot be the only or predominant criteria behind drawing a district. So simply having a racial concentration is not enough to justify that district. You have to be able to talk about other factors such as neighborhoods or communities. I'm sorry if I left that out because that actually is a very important factor. Race alone should not be the only reason a district is drawn. Now to get to the can-dos, these are the factors we really want to focus the debate on tonight and throughout the process. These are factors like communities of interest. What are your neighborhoods? What are your shared problems, as one San Diego redistricting commissioner put it back in 2011? Areas that have similar concerns, similar problems, maybe caused by the same thing, like maybe neighborhoods off of a particularly busy street like Palm Avenue, neighborhoods off of the beach who have shared issues regarding being close to the beach, neighborhoods near a military base or near a wetlands, areas in the same attendance area or same school zones, areas, and I'm giving off a few of these to kind of get you thinking about these kinds of communities of interest. But I can tell you I've been to a lot of places, and the issues vary depending on where you are. So we need you to tell us, what are your communities of interest? What are major roads, for example? What are natural features that are good dividing lines? And what are major roads or natural features that are not good dividing lines? When we're working in the city of San Diego, people on both sides of Adams Avenue said, don't divide us. That's not a street that you should be drawing district line down. But when it came to El Cajon Boulevard, that community said, yes, El Cajon is the line to draw it down. So, we need to hear from you which streets are good dividing lines, which ones are bad dividing lines. And so we've touched on those other factors, major roads, visible boundaries, compactness, contiguity, the principle that each district represents a cohesive neighborhood or community. You can get from one part of a district to any other part of that district without leaving the district or having to travel through a different city or the ocean. Finally, we're thinking about growth since 2010. Where do we know the population has changed? Where do we know that things are planned for the next year or year and a half? And ultimately respecting the voters' wishes as the principle that the voters of the city did elect a city council, and that redistricting should not be used as a way of targeting a particular member, because it's up to the voters to make that decision about whether or not to retain that council member. So looking at some of the basic demographic features of the city, this will be available online as well, so you'll be able to look in this more detail. I want to highlight that we don't just consider population and race. We do look at a whole lot of other factors, including education, the shares of renters versus owners throughout the city. And you tell us what to look into. Like I said before, we go all over the state and we find different things matter. When we're working with the school district, one of the big things that came up was the year the houses were built. And so some of the newer neighborhoods out in East Lake versus some of the slightly older neighborhoods in Bonita had a very different interest as a result. And all of this is in the data we're looking at. So tell us which ones to think about. Tell us which ones you want us to emphasize. I'll just point out the total population, 26,324 people counted on April 1st, 2010. So we're looking at district sizes of about 6,000 people or so, give or take. We will have the exact number on the map handout that we have for you to fill out tomorrow. Latinos make up a plurality of the total population, 49%, but not of citizen voting age population. Latinos make up a smaller share, 41%, than non-Hispanic whites at 44%. This is a trend that we see across the state because the Latino community tends to be younger and less likely to be citizens. And we focus on that citizen voting age or eligible voting population because that's what the courts tell us to focus on. And so we can look at that in a map. The areas in pink are over 75% Latino by eligible voting. I know it's hard to see. I promise you, we have this. We have it in the presentation in a much better color version. I know it's the lights that are, making it a little hard to see here. The areas in blue or purple are under 35% Latino. And so we see that kind of in the northeast and eastern portions of the city, that we have a higher Latino population than we do in the west and sort of along the central part of the city. Looking at Asian Americans and African Americans, we don't see a specific neighborhood or concentration that shows up with the percentage data. But if there are neighborhoods that we know about, especially historic communities or communities that have developed within the last 10 years, let us know so that we can take that into account. Tell us where they are. So just because we're not seeing it numerically doesn't mean it may not exist. Just to give you some ideas of some different kinds of districts that have been drawn, we can see some examples of very compact maps that some cities, Glendale, Compton, have had. We also see some examples of some districts that are not quite as compact. Most of these are drawn for a very specific reason. Central High, for example, or Central Unified, is a school district in the Central Valley that has a large rural area and a substantial suburban neighborhood, and they wanted to make sure each district had some of the suburban area and some of the rural area. South Pasadena, down here in the center, wanted to make sure every district touched Colorado Boulevard. They wanted to make sure every district had a stake in their major commercial corridor. A lot of smaller cities often have a community plan area or a downtown area or a feature that they want to make sure all the districts touch if they can. On the other hand, others opt for more compact maps. And we want to show you the variety because we want you to tell us which one works best here. And so that really is about what our discussion is today. What are your communities of interest? What are the neighborhoods of the city that we should be looking at and taking into account? What are the factors that we should consider when drawing the maps? And of course, what questions can we answer tonight? This is our kickoff. This is our first presentation. So what questions do you have? What information do you need to take back to your family and friends, to your community groups and churches and other organizations, civic organizations, to help draw the best districts possible for the city of Imperial Beach? Like we mentioned before, we would really appreciate it if you filled out a comment card if you want to speak, so that we can put you on or add you to our mailing list. Of course, you don't have to join the mailing list if you don't want. This will notify you in advance of any future meetings, any future discussions we have. You can also speak without a comment card simply by raising your hand. We will have a microphone going around, and we invite you to answer questions. So.
Hi, my name is Sarah Schneider. Is this on? Hi, my name is Starna Schneider. First, I want to say thank you. Thank you for being here tonight and what your company does to gather all this research and information to deliver to our community. My question is, after you figure out how you're going to break up the city into districts, how does that impact our current council that's seated at the time? How do they determine which district they're responsible for?
That's a great question. So what happens in this, I say, transition from at-large to district elections? And the short answer is that all city council members continue to be responsible for the entire city, fiduciarily, legally. That relationship doesn't change. All that changes is now, what generally happens is now as a constituent, you have one number to call rather than four. And that you have a council member who has a very direct stake in your neighborhood. Now, in terms of the process, what we say is those districts take effect in the election, after the election held in that district. So up until 2020, up until the first election held, the council members still represent at large. Were elected by all the members of the city, including those who are going to be elected this November. And they continue to represent the entire city until 2020. In 2020, 2 council members will be elected from districts, and those 2 will be directly accountable to their districts. The other 2 will be continued to serve at large. And then in 2022, those other 2 districts will come into effect, and you'll have a full district. And at that point, it'll be very clear because you'll have 1 member per district. What other cities around here have often done, if you have 1 member per district, it's very easy to kind of figure out who might be responsible in the future. Sometimes there's simply like we designate a representative if there's a vacant seat up until that district is filled. But I really emphasize that council members continue to serve the entire city, especially like legally responsible and financially responsible to all voters or to all residents.
Hi, my name is Marcus Wood. Thank you, as Anisha said. I'm still a little confused on once this goes into effect, the residents from each district can only vote on council members from their district. Is that correct?
So that's right. What this will create is district elections like you have for state assembly or state senate or Congress, where you have 1 representative who comes from this district. You're not voting in district 52 because your seat is 53. So it'll be the same sort of relationship. You'll have a district representative, although the mayor will continue to be elected through all voters in the city.
So how about 4 or 5 districts?
I believe 4, 4 plus a mayor. And that's a choice a lot of cities this kind of size make because, having in a city this small, it's much more difficult to talk about districts than in a city the size of San Diego or even Chula Vista. So having at least a mayor who represents the entire city plus a council member gives you at least a voice in 2 of the 5 seats.
Good evening, Mitch McKay. My question is kind of a follow-up to the last question. So will it be, in fact, that a candidate for a district will then have to have a residence requirement of that specific district?
Yes, there will be a residency requirement for anyone running in a seat, a district seat. Yeah, you have to live where you represent.
As a candidate running for district area, some issues that may apply would be the cost of being a candidate. So I'd like to see if that would be addressed in city ordinance that would lower that cost. So both other people would have opportunity to run.
guess I wanted to know, what is the current distribution of the city council members and the mayor's residence? How does that play out? Are they well dispersed in the community? Or are they focused in a certain part of the city of Imperial Beach?
Do you want me to answer that a little bit?
If you'd like to.
Okay, I can do that later. Right now, we have, of course, the mayor's going to be elected at large, so that's probably someone insignificant. Right now, the two council members that their terms are expiring are Councilman Ward Bragg, who lives kind of in the center part of the city, and Councilman Ed Spritz, who lives in the western part of the city. The other two council members, one lives in the western part of the city and one lives kind of in the northern part of the city. So right now, the district that probably isn't represented is the eastern part.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Nicole. Since my eastern part, this eastern part, is not represented now, does that mean that people who are on the city council, who I feel represent my interests now, will no longer represent me? And also, I want to know how are we going to keep partisan politics out of city politics once this begins? And is this eventually?
Well, I can answer, maybe we'll give you a partial answer to that question. Elections will continue to be nonpartisan. This does not change that. Mention California law requires all local elections to be nonpartisan. And what this does is it changes who you get to vote for in terms of your local representative, because you'll be able to vote for your district representative plus the mayor. You won't be able to vote in the other three districts. But like I said, all council members are responsible for the entire city. And if, in a city this size, I'm sure that there's going to be a council member in another district that you probably know or have heard about or have met at some point. And at that point, it's up to them and the city to figure out how that relationship works. In terms of, and that's what I can say is you'll have a representative who represents your neighborhood. That doesn't stop you from going to another council member.
I asked you a question. Is this going to, oh no, I'm sorry, you answered two of them. The last one was, is this a done deal?
So the city
This already happened, we were having to say it.
So the city has decided to do this within the 90 days to avoid potential future litigation. If the situation with the California Voting Rights Act were to change in the future, the city might be able to make a different decision. But under this is because of the California Voting Rights Act.
That's why I'm
Yes.
I actually have a question just similar to that. So is this kind of like an extortion by threat, or what's going on, and why is it now happening and it didn't happen years ago? And what's so horrible about that large city council? I don't understand how it's so bad.
Well, I don't want to use the word extortion myself, but I'm certainly your friend to use it. This is certainly something where attorneys have figured out how to target as many jurisdictions as possible, as many cities and school districts throughout the state as possible, but they can't target them all at once because they can't follow that many. So the average size is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. More than that, I'd say that we're seeing this across the state. So it's not just here, but other cities of 25,000 people or so are also.
But are there conditions for that? I mean, did we meet all those conditions that says that we're out of compliance, or what?
All a demand letter has to say is that they believe you are out of compliance, and the city admits no liability. The city admits no liability by making this change. Where's the microphone? We'll line you first, I think, and then they'll take it. Even you.
So my second question is in regards to breaking up the city. So obviously city staff is more astute at this than residents may be, or those who work in government already. So what type of tools are you going to provide the community so they feel good about the decisions that they're giving input on, or the final outcome of those conversations with the community?
So, as starting tomorrow, at our public hearing tomorrow, we're going to introduce the public participation kit, which will be a tool that you can use to draw potential boundaries for the city, whether you want to draw one district or the entire city map, and we're going to be drawing in all of those proposals. In addition, all the maps will be available at least 7 days before the meeting. We will work with the city, and the city will work in particular, to go as public as possible with that. Certainly, all of our notification lists, all of our organizations and community groups, and we're going to work on publicizing that. And besides that, we're really hoping that we start to get the word of mouth out tonight that this is going on. This is a little bit of I call it esoteric issue. It's not one where you tend to get a lot of people just interested automatically in. We kind of have to motivate people to show up. And, we know that's really hard because, we have to get people away from a beautiful sunset that I was watching at the beach before I had to come to this meeting tonight. So how do we do that? And if you know of organizations or groups that we could work with or notify, this presentation will be online. This actually, I think we're recording it tonight so that we can put this entire meeting online. So anybody who was not here tonight can watch this entire.
And just for clarity, if they're not available to attend the meeting tomorrow at 3 o'clock because we have our candidate debate, so the likely we're going to be preparing for that, and they know about that because it's been widely publicized, so we're probably working in tune to that. My concern is that the window is so close, and it has to be because you're in a 90-day deadline, so it's not the city's fault or anyone's like that, but making sure that we really push this out to social media, put it in the Eagle Times, like everywhere we possibly can, so the community at least are aware of it and how they engage with the city to get their voices heard. Is probably my biggest concern.
And we'll continue to work with the city on all of these efforts to make sure we get the widest audience possible.
I had one last question. In the beginning of the presentation, we see the penalties that have been assessed to the communities that have lost their case in court. Who reaps the benefits of the decision of the court? Who receives the penalty?
It does. And that's the thing.
Because that's my tax money
it's
going somewhere, and I wanted to know.
And it's going to the attorneys. It's not going to the members of. Look, I guess the answer to the question is why districts? Because you're trying to increase representation of groups that don't have representation currently on the council. The money from these settlements is not going to those members of the community. It's going to the attorneys who are suing on their behalf.
I'm trying to figure out exactly how I want to word it. The 90 days, I assume, starts today.
It started September, yeah.
So we were serving.
No, it starts the day the city council announces their intent to switch to district elections.
So, and that's already been announced?
Yes. That was the last city council meeting.
Is NEC already contracted for the next redistricting?
No.
And follow-up question, is NEC at all affiliated with
other than we have worked with a lot of cities that have been sued by him after the fact. So the city received a letter, and then as with that letter, the city had 45 days to respond. They respond within that 45 days with the intent to switch, and then that starts the 90-day window.
I have a question about demographics, because this is based off the 2010 consensus. And recently, I went online looking at the San Diego County housing, and they had consensus information from 2015, which was already outdated. There has been a lot of changes just in the last few years here, so that's why I'm asking. And we're going to change, we're going to base it on 2010 now, and then we do it again in 2020, it's going to cost us.
I have to explain one thing, is that in 2015, it's not the full census. It's not a total count of the population. It's a sample of about 1% of households. And all of this right-hand column of data comes from that same data set. The left-hand column, especially this total population that we're required to use, that's what's from 2010. The reason is because for 2015, for the American Community Survey 2015, all we have is a city number. We don't have individual block numbers, population counts. We don't have that 100% count of the population. All we have is a sample based on 1%. So it's a good estimate, but it's not the data that's required under state law to use.
But I'm saying that was 2010 is even more out, because more has changed since then.
Well, but the thing is, we don't have 2015 census data at the block.
So why do you use the next year?
So that 2015 survey, that was released this January. That was released in 2018. Because it's basically a statistical measure. It's not a real census. They don't count everybody. They count 1% of the population, so maybe one person in this room got the survey, and they're going from that one person to the entire community based on a 1% sample. And that's why the state doesn't let us use it. The state actually requires the most recent census, decennial census, so 2010. You know, that's a really good question. That is a really good question. The 90-day window to protect from future litigation means that we have to do it now. Because waiting for 2020 would open up a 3-year window where the city could face basically a lawsuit because they decided to wait. And the only city that I know that's decided to do that is paying quite a big sum to be able to wait.
But the reason they do that, obviously, is to affect the 2020 election instead of wait till the 2020 election. They'll be affecting it. You had mentioned that this will be available online. How soon? I'd like to be able to write some stuff up on it.
Sure. Well, we'll go work with the city to get the presentation up tomorrow when we get the public participation kit up tomorrow as well. And so I think if this is not already up, then it will be up first thing tomorrow, or as soon as we can tomorrow. City's website. We have an entire page that's set up for district elections, where we have all of our public hearings listed and locations listed. That's where it'll be.
So I initially thought there was going to be a duplicate sessions, but it looks like more today is informational and tomorrow's more workshop.
So the presentation is the same in both, although we will go through how to do the public participation kit tomorrow as well. We were hoping to do that today. We just wasn't in final state yet, wasn't the final product yet.
So what we need to do is
So-
others to come tomorrow and have a special.
And they can learn how to use the tools, and they'll be out by the time the mayor, the candidate forum. We'll be done by the time the candidate forum starts. The one, well, we'll make an announcement at the end of this tonight for where and when tomorrow, and I don't know besides that what else the city has done.
So we blasted it through our social media outlets, emailed it to various organizations throughout town, published it in the UT, and we posted flyers throughout town as well.
Again, Mitch McKay, I had a question earlier in the presentation. You had a slide where you showed no cities prevailing against lawsuits. Is that correct? There's never been a city that's defended against this litigation?
Yeah, there has never been a city that has successfully.
And how long have these litigations been going?
The two that have gone, well, one of them, well, actually, the one that went to trial, which was Palmdale, lasted about 6 months in trial. It took over a year to get the decision. They actually vacated the results of an election they held and ordered the election reheld. And in the other case that's ongoing right now, it's in the city of Santa Monica. That case has already been over a month at trial, including some expert witnesses, each testifying for over a week.
Okay. The second question is more of a follow-up with your demographics. You talked about the east part of the city having a higher Hispanic population and the correlation between, or maybe the lack of correlation between the number of people that live in that area and those who vote. I've studied some of the recent election issues within the city of Imperial Beach, and although we may have 26, 27,000 residents, we only have about 11,000 people who are actually registered to vote. I would bet that when you segregate that east section, they're going to be woefully underrepresented. It'll almost be inverse discrimination because they'll have less people voting on who's going to represent their part of town. I really have the difficulty buying into the whole argument of this lawsuit. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Please feel free.
There's no take $30,000.
Yes. Do we still have to pay the $30,000? The answer is yes, but it's capped at $30,000. They can't ask, even if they ask for more, they can't get more. The lawyer sent the demand letter. And that's why 100 cities and 150 school districts have done this. Yeah. So with that, our next forum is tomorrow night or tomorrow afternoon, 3 p.m. at the City Library. Please invite your friends, family, neighbors, community groups. We'd love to see you there. For those of you who want to get on our mailing list, please fill out a comment card. Even if you didn't speak tonight, you can still fill out a comment card and get added to our list for upcoming events. We thank you so much for coming. We continue to welcome your comments and feedback. Even if you don't want to do it in public, please write us, email us. We're happy to take it any way we get. So with that, we have one last question.
So if you're not able to make the meeting tomorrow at the library and they go to the link and they download the packet, is there like a tutorial on how to utilize the packet?
There are instructions on the map, in the packet. There's also an email address that we've set up specifically for the project, Imperial Beach at ndcresearch.com. That'll be, and so that goes right to us, so we can answer questions as you're doing it. We can take your maps. Anything that we receive goes to council. They will see a record of all comments throughout the process, not just the maps.
I know you've helped several communities with this. I'm just wondering, before they look at the participation map, can you give us some idea of what other cities have used to form districts, whether that might be elementary school boundaries, whether that might be major roadways, rivers? What are some of the things that they use so that we can be thinking about the best ways to form our?
So I think the biggest one is neighborhoods. Like what you consider your neighborhood to be. If, like some cities like San Diego have very formal neighborhoods, but most cities don't. They just have a general, this is the downtown area, this is the eastern area, this is the riverbank area, whatever they called it. Those kind of neighborhoods are probably what we hear the most of. And a lot of times what they are is they're bounded by roads. The bigger the road, the wider it is, generally speaking, the more communities form on either side of it rather than across it. Rivers and other wetlands, other kinds of canals or preserves. Oftentimes, if there is, like, for example, an area that's affected by a particular, like a military base or a school, the community around that could be an attendance area. And that's something we often see, especially in school districts, when people talk about this attendance area, even in cities, because you have to cross the same streets to get to those schools. You have to deal with the same road issues relating to traffic around those schools. We've shopping centers and malls, redevelopment projects. That's another thing that creates communities. Areas that tend to patronize the same stores or places. In communities on the beach, we often find that there are particular places that are kind of landmarks on the beach that people tend to see themselves as closer to this part and to that part. And so even though it looks like one long beach, maybe there's distinct neighborhoods along it. And really it's just what you think, what you see, what you live. And so hopefully that gives you some idea. But everywhere I go, it's different. So
I want to hear from you.
One more question. This is actually probably more oriented to the city attorney. Are there no mitigating criteria such as total land size, population, any other factors that preclude this city from being sucked into this?
So, no. The answer is no. The smallest city that's been sued has under 10,000 people. It's 8,500 people. The smallest landmass of a city that's been sued is about half the size of this. It's a little small suburb of LA. And honestly, it doesn't matter. The only mitigating criteria is if you can demonstrate there is no racially polarized voting in your city. And that basically means showing that there's no difference between how whites, blacks, Latinos, Asians, any group has voted, not only in your local city elections, but also in county and state elections, also in federal elections. You would have to demonstrate conclusively no racially polarized voting ever. That's the only way to be perfectly safe.
I'm going to hand this to Darnish, but before everyone goes, real quick, because there's some people starting to leave, if anybody has questions that, maybe you don't want to ask a demographer or whatever, I just want to give you my email address, and you're welcome to send me an email, and we'll do what we can to answer it. But it's just ahall@imperialbeachca.gov, and I'll do the best I can to answer it.
She went to very well.
And so, because we just want to make sure that we are giving you guys as much opportunity to contact us as possible. So it's ahall, Andy Hall, ahall@Imperial Beach, CA, written out, yes, imperialbeachca.gov. We should probably make it longer if we possibly can. I don't know why we didn't do IBCA or something, but it's imperialbeachca.gov. Andy Hall.
It's going to be my last question, I promise. So based on these two comments, they kind of triggered a thought for me. Based on some of the other cities that have already gone through this process, are there any cities that may have similar demographics? I know we're pretty small, 4.7 miles, but population, things of that nature that we can kind of look at to kind of educate ourselves and get more familiar with how they came to the conclusion to divide up their city that we could look at?
So, I would certainly encourage you to take a look at the cities nearby that have gone through this. Chula Vista, for example, went through this back in 2014, although they're much larger. Solana, earlier this year, Carlsbad, Oceanside, Solana Beach, and Encinitas went through this. And And actually, a city with very similar demographics in many ways, Escondido, went through this in 2014. In terms of, I'm trying to think of in the same population and demographic range. And none are coming to the top of my mind right now, but we can certainly look into it. La Mirada, which is up in Los Angeles County, would probably be a close example. They're also plurality Latino, but they have a much larger Asian population there. Some of the cities in Orange County that have gone through this also, but may have a larger Asian population. It's like there's been 100 of them, and I'm just trying to go through the list, and so many of them, there's all sorts of cities that we've seen go through this. But I would start with some of the ones in the area, because you're going to find maybe people in the community who participated. Imperial Beach was kept together in the high school process, in the South Bay Union High School districting process. But there was a lot of discussion about which community should Imperial Beach be linked to. Did it have more in common with parts of Chula Vista or San Ysidro? Because it was too small on its own to be an entire district. So South Bay Elementary had to be linked to another community. Sweetwater, sorry.
And that was a good thing, because we need representation for consent. So it was a good thing. But one thing I wanted to ask was Coronado. I think I read somewhere that they are not area or district identified yet. So are they in the same boat as we are?
They've not received a letter to my knowledge yet. But I can tell you that Coronado's demographics, they're over 85% white by eligible voters, which is much more like Poway, which went through this and didn't have any real racial issues because there was no concentration of Latino population there. So that wouldn't be my first analogy to another city. But to my knowledge, they haven't received a letter.
This is kind of a follow-up to the gentleman in the plaid shirt, and somebody else made a comment. It's the reason, the demographic reason for this could not, in my opinion, be more evident in Imperial Beach. If you look at the breakup of Hispanic population being 49% in 2010, and it's been at least that for many years before that. If you take the time to look at everybody that's been a council member or a mayor in the city since it was incorporated over 50 years ago, there's never been a Hispanic surname, ever.
Okay, well, thank you to everyone who came. Like I said, please feel free to fill out a comment card if you want to get on our list. We look forward to hearing from you throughout this process.